The cabin sat nestled deep in the mountains, a place of serenity that most people could only dream of. Pine trees stretched high into the sky, their needles whispering secrets to the wind. Birds sang their morning songs, and a small creek trickled nearby, its water sparkling in the early sunlight. My wife, Amelia, had been unpacking the last of our bags, humming softly as she arranged the kitchen. I watched her from the porch, sipping my coffee and feeling a rare moment of peace. After months of city chaos, the cabin felt like a sanctuary. But serenity is fragile, and in our case, it was about to be shattered. It all started with a letter that arrived the week before. The envelope was plain, stamped with the emblem of our local homeowners association, but it carried an unmistakable threat. According to the letter, someone had complaints about our property. The words were vague but ominous, hinting at fines, legal action, and worst of all, threats of immediate removal. Normally, HOA letters are petty annoyances, little administrative headaches that are easy to ignore. But there was something in the tone that felt different, sinister, almost gleeful in its menace. Amelia had dismissed it at first, rolling her eyes. "They're just bored, sweetheart. Let them stew," she said, brushing it off as trivial. I, however, didn't feel reassured. My instincts had been sharpened by years in the U.S. Marshal Service, years spent navigating dangerous people and unpredictable situations. There was a tension beneath that letter that most wouldn't notice, but I did. I knew better than to ignore it. The days passed without incident, and I allowed myself to relax a little. We went on long hikes, cooked elaborate meals together, and enjoyed evenings by the fireplace, the crackling flames casting dancing shadows across the cabin walls. But all the while, I kept a discreet eye on the road leading to the cabin. My gut told me something was coming. Then, one cloudy afternoon, the tranquility shattered. Amelia had gone to collect firewood from a small shed near the back of the cabin. I was inside, sorting through some old files, when I heard a strange noise, a vehicle crunching over the gravel driveway. I peered through the window and froze. Two men in dark uniforms stepped out of a black SUV. They wore hats and sunglasses, and their demeanor was rigid, almost theatrical. But something was off. Their badges looked cheap, plastic, almost comically fake. "Amelia, get inside!" I shouted, and she turned, startled, dropping a piece of firewood. Her eyes widened as she saw the men approaching. One of them raised a hand. "Sir, ma'am, this is a U.S. HOA enforcement action. You are required to comply with our orders." I blinked. My brow furrowed. "HOA enforcement action?" I repeated, trying to suppress the laugh that threatened to escape. "Do you have a badge number? Or is this part of a Halloween costume early?" The men exchanged glances. "Sir, please step back. You are obstructing an official operation." I stepped out of the cabin, my hand casually resting on the side of my hip, where a holster would have been if this were a real raid. "Look, gentlemen," I said, my voice calm but laced with authority, "I suggest you check your credentials. Because if you think you're here to arrest anyone on my property, you clearly don't know who you're dealing with." Amelia clutched my arm. "Why you mean?" Her voice trembled. "Yes," I said, taking a slow step toward the men. "You've got the wrong house. Or maybe you think intimidation works. Let me clarify, I command you, Marshals. I don't recommend testing my hospitality." For a moment, the two men hesitated. Their confident postures faltered slightly, replaced with unease. Then, one of them sneered. "We've dealt with people like you before. You won't scare us." That was the trigger. I wasn't just going to scare them, I was going to teach them a lesson they'd never forget. With a simple gesture, I activated a silent alert. Within minutes, vehicles descended the winding mountain road, black SUVs with tinted windows, men in tactical gear stepping out. The fake HOA cops realized their mistake far too late. Panic flashed across their faces. They tried to retreat toward their SUV, but it was too late. Amelia screamed, clinging to me, but I held her steady. "Stay calm," I whispered. "They won't hurt us. Not today." By the time they understood what was happening, the U.S. Marshals had surrounded them. My fake cabin invasion had turned into a real law enforcement intervention. The imposters were cuffed, shouting, trying to explain themselves, but the words fell on deaf ears. My team had them under control. They had come to threaten my family, but they were about to pay a heavy price. I walked back to the cabin, Amelia following close behind. The wind rustled through the pine trees, carrying the distant sounds of sirens and shouting. I turned to her and smiled, though my heart was still pounding. "Are you okay?" I asked. She nodded, tears streaking her cheeks. I thought they were real. "I thought they were real in intent, not authority," I said, squeezing her hand. "And that's a big difference." Even as the adrenaline faded, a part of me was already planning the next steps. Fake cops on my property? They had to be dealt with in a way that sent a message to anyone else who might think of crossing us. The mountains, the cabin, and my family's safety weren't going to be toyed with. And this was only the beginning. When the dust settled and the imposters were locked in the back of a federal transport van, I thought the story would end there. Two con artists dressed in imitation authority, humiliated and handcuffed. Problem solved. But the look on the younger man's face when they seized his phone told me otherwise. It was the same look I'd seen on suspects who thought they'd gotten away with murder until the evidence caught up to them. Greed leaves tracks. People who take orders from the wrong people rarely stay careful about covering their tracks. We drove back to the cabin in the heavy silence that follows a fight. Amelia sat close, her fingers finding mine and refusing to let go. The marshals took statements, photographed the scene, and catalogued every scrap of paper, badge, and laminated card the men had on them. My team did their work like surgeons, precise, efficient, unemotional. Outside, the mountain air was thin and clear. Inside, the cabin felt impossibly small, as if the walls had been waiting to hear the truth. It didn't take long for the first breadcrumb to surface. One of the counterfeit badges had a sticker peeled back on the inside, revealing a name scrawled in a different ink. The phone, which the younger man had frantically tried to delete, refused to surrender its secrets. My techs pulled messages, voice memos, and photos. There were encrypted chats with a payee named Lee_HOA and a series of wire transfers documented with references like cleanup and property management. The sums were petty by criminal standards but enough to point to an organizer who had been buying intimidation rather than legal counsel. "Lee?" Amelia asked aloud, reading over my shoulder. Could it be Lee from the neighborhood? Lee Harper? A cold ripple ran through me. Lee Harper was the HOA president, a man with a shirt so pressed he looked ironed by the wind. He'd worn the town's self-righteousness like armor for years, policing fences and flowerbeds with a zeal that made people laugh and cry in the same breath. If Lee was behind this, it wasn't just a prank. It was personal. We didn't confront him that day. That would be amateur hour. Instead, I told the marshals to secure everything and let the federal process breathe. Evidence collection, chain of custody, proper affidavits. In my experience, the humiliation of men like Lee often fossils into something more dangerous when they sense they are losing face. They react. They lash out. They're predictable. Over the next 48 hours, the small mountain town became a pressure cooker. The local news picked up on a story about fake officials in tactical wear being arrested at a private cabin. The clip of the younger man stumbling over his lies while the marshals read his rights went viral on several local feeds. Comments stacked up: outrage, relief, schadenfreude. Lee Harper called an emergency HOA meeting in an attempt to steer the narrative. He stood in the community hall with his tie tightened like a noose and tried to act wounded, but his words had the brittle quality of someone being read their obituary in the classifieds. I could have let the law take its course. Courts would handle the imposters and the fraud charges. But the law moves like glacier ice, inevitable, slow, and blind to the nuance of vengeance. I wanted more than a courtroom victory. I wanted the town to understand why this had happened and who had ordered it. I wanted the same sense of exposure that makes a crooked man shrink in the light. So I played a different hand. The marshals and I had evidence, the phone logs, the bank transfers, the photos of the men receiving envelopes from a courier at the edge of Lee's property. We also had something more human than data, something that stung, a recorded voice message from Lee's assistant thanking the men for handling a certain house and promising further directions. It was direct, damning, and definitive. I called a press conference. We set it up outside the community hall the day after Lee's meeting. Cameras lined the parking lot like a field of anxious birds. Neighbors clustered at the edges, drawn by curiosity and a hunger for justice. Amelia stood beside me, one more reason my chest was a blister of fierce protectiveness. The marshal who had led the arrest read the facts meticulously, no theatrics, no editorializing. Then I stepped forward and told the town what they needed to know, that intimidation had been bought and paid for using funds tied to the HOA, that the so-called cleanup crew had been hired to harass, frighten, and in some instances surveil residents who resisted directives, that the line between community standards and criminal coercion had been crossed deliberately. The worst part for Lee was the ledger, an accounting spreadsheet printed out from one of the imposters' phones showing dates, amounts, and descriptions. People who had once tolerated Lee's petty edicts now stared at him with something like appalled recognition. There were screenshots of private messages in which Lee celebrated the fear he'd instilled in a neighbor for removing a fence without consultation. There were video clips of a fundraiser where he'd joked about taking care of people who stepped out of line. He tried to smooth and explain, but his mouth worked like a defective valve. Words came out, but they had lost all capacity to knit things back together. When the sheriff arrived, hat in hand and expression carefully neutral, the room cracked open. He read the evidence and then excused himself. The county prosecutor called in a week later. Lee Harper resigned from the HOA that evening with a quarrel of words and none of the dignity it should have carried. The community board voted him out emphatically within days. Temperatures cooled in the town, but a new current ran through it, a cautious one that smelled faintly like relief and freshly exposed rot. But Lee was not the only rot. The recordings and financial trails implicated a handful of local businesses, property management firms and a contractor who had made a tidy profit from enforcement contracts. People whose livelihoods had depended on turning a blind eye suddenly found themselves at the center of subpoenas, audits, and sour looks over coffee. The town's sense of enchantment with its own order was gone. In its place was a brittle, wary vigilance. Still, the revenge that satisfied me most was not the legal unraveling. It was the public theater. Lee had always relished the ritual of the HOA meeting, the little stage where he could lecture and control. I arranged, legally and with full disclosure to the authorities, for a town hall where those he had targeted could speak unmuted. Not a mob, not a trial, but a forum. People came forward with stories of intimidation, of threats of fines that never materialized but left a sting, of whispered phone calls and driveway surveillance. They read letters into the record, tears jangling and laughter that sounded like something you shake out of a rug. Amelia gave a short statement too. She spoke not of fear but of how it felt to be watched on her own land, of the small indignities that pile up and become a mountain if no one notices them. "We came here for quiet," she said, and the room understood. She didn't ask for revenge. She asked for a town that could stand without terror. It was a simpler, cleaner reproof than any of my tactical maneuvers. In private, however, I allowed myself a little theater of my own. The imposters, processed and prosecuted, had their sentences reduced after plea deals but not before the prosecutor used their testimony to pursue the larger conspiracy. Lee, while avoiding jail, was hit with fines, civil suits, and a censure that made any future authority he might brandish look tinny and absurd. He lost clients. Businesses dropped contracts with his preferred firms. He had to sell his property at a loss to cover legal fees. There is a special kind of ruin that feels tailored to the crime, not violent retribution, but shriveling social currency. Watching him attend smaller and less important meetings, growing more dulled with each audience, satisfied a part of me I didn't know needed satisfaction. Revenge tastes different when it is public. It sours if it is private and burns if it is cruel. I wanted corrective justice, not cruelty. The town needed restoration, not spectacle. Still, I admit that when Lee's replacement stood at the next HOA meeting with a nervous new posture and promised transparency, a small, private smile crossed my face. The balance had shifted. People who had been afraid to garden how they wanted or park where they pleased began to do so. The creek by our cabin no longer felt watched. But the peace was not complete. The same men had not acted alone. There were accomplices in the wings, those who benefit when fear is an operative tool. I had rattled one part of the machine, but the gears kept turning elsewhere. That knowledge lodged in me like a splinter. Justice had been served for now, but vigilance was a muscle that must be exercised. I had the Marshals' ear and the town's gratitude, but I also had a promise made quietly to Amelia over coffee one dawn when the pine sap smelled sweet and the world still felt new. "No more surprises," I said, and she nodded. "No more fake badges on our doorstep. No more people who think they can scare us because they can't abide our peace." She smiled, and in her eyes I read the same resolution. The case had been won, the first round of the war concluded. But the map of enemies was not yet fully revealed. As I watched the last of the investigators drive away, I knew the next steps would be subtle, patient, and perhaps a little cruel in their cunning. Justice had been set into motion, and I intended to keep it moving until the entire thread had been pulled through the eye of whatever needle had stitched this together. We locked the cabin that night with a deliberate click, as if that sound, small and domestic, could steady the future. Outside, the pines whispered. Inside, Amelia hummed a tune under her breath while she prepared tea, and for the first time since the impostors arrived, the house felt like a place where the shadows belonged only to the firelight. The months that followed the public unraveling of Lee Harper felt like a long winter that was finally learning how to melt. The town was quieter in a different way, not the hush of fear but the cautious hush of people who had seen how rotten things could get and chose to rebuild. Gardens returned to their ungoverned glory. Neighbors stopped checking with a committee before planting lavender. Amelia and I walked the ridgeline at dusk and let the soft roar of the creek argue with the silence. For a while I entertained the pleasant illusion that the story had ended. But the splinter I'd felt earlier refused to be ignored. The evidence had shown Lee's hand in the impostor's payroll and the contractor's bookkeeping, yet the ledgers hinted at a deeper circulation of influence. Small vendors who had supplied the HOA with management solutions were suddenly busier than their books justified. A developer who had purchased parcels on the edge of town the year before had been given unusually favorable covenants. Money moves don't hide forever, they curl up eventually and show you where they came from. I began to pull. The Marshals were busy with other cases, but they had granted me a narrow lane of cooperation. I hired an independent investigator, the sort with a patience for paper and a hunger for patterns. He spent mornings in basements hunched under fluorescent lights and evenings at town bars easing the tongues of men who preferred gin to subpoenas. The more we dug, the more the network looked like a web woven around convenience and cowardice, developers paying HOA officers for silence, contractors realizing how profitable slight intimidation could be, and a small cadre of local politicians who wore civic virtue like a mask while they traded favors behind the curtains. At the center of the web sat a corporation with a logo so bland and official that no one had questioned it, Cedar Ridge Management. On paper, Cedar Ridge managed estates with the austere care of a funeral director. In practice they had been selling a package, compliance consulting, pressure tactics, and the occasional hired muscle disguised as field auditors. The imposters who'd come to our cabin were rookies, small fish who'd been fed a script and a check. Above them were men who had the luxury of not getting their hands dirty. I remember the day we decided to reveal Cedar Ridge. It was a plan stitched together by legal counsel, the Marshals liaison, and a small group of residents who had the courage to stand in the light. There would be no ambush, no theatrics that crossed into vigilantism. Instead, we built a case that was airtight, and then we invited the town to watch the fall. We scheduled a hearing at the county court with press invited. The complaint was long and precise. It detailed the financial flows, the emails that proved coordination, the contracts written to look lawful but containing clauses that allowed for enforcement actions. We had whistleblowers, former Cedar Ridge employees who testified under oath about directive calls from men wearing suits, about envelopes passed in parking lots, about managers who toasted results at holiday parties. Those words, when said in a courtroom, became a different kind of weapon. They were not violence, they were truth made heavy with consequence. On the morning of the hearing, the town hall was full. Amelia squeezed my hand under the bench and gave a small look that meant more than any speech I could give. The prosecutor walked through a timeline that made the jury's faces tighten like a string being wound. We laid out how Cedar Ridge had marketed a product of fear and how Lee and his allies had bought it to fortify their control. We showed invoices with coded line items. We played recorded calls where men laughed about moving the chess pieces and referenced houses as targets. By the time the whistleblower's testimony finished, the murmur in the courtroom was a low, electric thing. People heard in those testimonies the confirmation of what they had suspected but couldn't always prove. The order to intimidate did not come from individual stubbornness alone. It came from a deliberate design to monetize control. The penalties were not theatrical. Cedar Ridge paid fines that stripped the gloss off their balance sheets. They lost contracts across the county as cities and homeowners balked at the idea of engagement with a firm tainted by coercion. Regulatory bodies investigated their licenses and found enough procedural violations to revoke a few. The small contractors who had thrived on the darker side of compliance were sued into insolvency or bought out under terms that kept them out of the market. Lee Harper's name, once a talisman of petty authority, became the anecdote used to warn newcomers about what not to become. But legal victories, while clean, can often feel cold. I wanted a restitution that had weight and a sting and a kind of cleansing promise. So I used the remaining tools at my disposal, not to break the law, but to turn the town's narrative into one of recovery led by the community. With funds recovered through civil suits and fines, we established a local trust dedicated to preserving property owners' rights and promoting transparent governance. The trust offered free legal clinics, funds for those wronged by illicit enforcement, and grants for community-led projects. It was a practical thing and an emblem. The very money used to buy fear was now buying resilience. It wasn't lost on me that the most delicious line of revenge slipped in quietly through that trust. Lee had once planned to use his influence to turn the precinct's old community house into a private annex for his friends. With Cedar Ridge's ruin, community members voted to repurpose the precinct into a community center that would host public meetings, a legal aid clinic, and a garden, open, noisy, and designed to belong to everyone. I attended the opening with Amelia and watched Lee drive past without stopping. He had to ride along the outer edge of a town that no longer needed his permission. The final flourish came one autumn evening when the town hosted a harvest fair in that very community center. Tables of pies and jars of preserves lined the hall. Children ran with painted faces. The mayor, a woman with a laugh that had been hard-won, stood on the makeshift stage and read a proclamation about civic responsibility. She then handed the microphone to Amelia. She stepped up and spoke without bitterness, without triumphalism, simply with facts, about the peace they had reclaimed and the vigilance they promised. When she finished, the room erupted in applause, not the hollow stuff of approval, but the kind that felt like a settling of dust. I stood there, hands in my pockets, and watched neighbors who had once cowered under petty rules hug each other like survivors who had found one another again. Later that night, as the fair wound down and lamps swung like sleepy moons over the creek, I took a walk alone to the old dock. The moon had made a clean white path across the water. I looked at the place where a few months prior, impostors had swaggered with fake authority and a plan to frighten a family from their home. The difference now felt almost holy. The dock was open, unpoliced, a simple wooden invitation to breath. I thought about revenge, how easy it is to mistake cruelty for justice, how simple it would have been to orchestrate something mean and irreversible. Instead, we had built a different kind of ending. We had placed consequences where they belonged. We had exposed the men who sold fear and reclaimed what they had tried to sell, peace of mind. Amelia joined me, carrying 2 mugs of tea. She handed me one without asking. We sat, shoulders touching, and watched the water keep its slow promise. "They won't forget," she said softly, the line between satisfaction and sorrow in her voice. "No," I replied, feeling the truth of it. "But they will remember what happens when a town decides it will not be bought." The last thread had been pulled through the eye of the needle, and whatever fabric remained was being rewoven by hands that understood the cost of leaving holes. In the end, the revenge had not been a single act of violence or vindictiveness. It had been patient, precise, and communal. It had been the steady unmasking of a system that profited from fear and the deliberate return of authority to the people who deserved it. We stood there a long while, 2 silhouettes against the water, until the moon blinked out behind a cloud and the town's gentle chorus of night sounds rose like an approval. The cabin behind us waited with its porch light steady, a little beacon that meant more than shelter. It meant that for as long as we were willing to tend it, our home would belong to us and to no one else.